Hello all, and now this is going to be a discussion video, really coordinating a bunch of different dissident thinkers together that I think are interesting, and it's kind of a footnote theory video, so I do these every once in a while. If you're not into that, obviously, you can just wait for the next educational, philosophical video, but nonetheless, I think there's a lot to gain here, and so I wanted to really start off with the discussion of reason as a conception of the world horizon of their own time. Obviously, in our perspective today, in our time, we can see that Locke didn't have the historical resources and accounting for world history that we have now, and so many of his assumptions and concepts that I've talked about, such as the tabula rasa, with things like psychoanalysis and modern science, obviously have a lot to refute with that. But nonetheless, I still think that there is a lot to distinguish with what John Locke was hoping to accomplish as, of course, an instantiation of his own drive of his people, and that Hobbesian sort of want to make peace and account and make a generalization and sort of form these sort of abstract ideals to go beyond class or even the authority of its time, because obviously he lived in that sort of vacuum within English history and all these sort of religious conflicts. It's kind of almost a tragic actually accounting if you really think about it. You can say that the critique of Locke really for us is that he fails to really make a context out of, his own history of, trying to basically, take a step back from, what was the drivers of, his own background, what was his own world horizon, or at least was self-aware enough to know that actually is a part of his own horizon, that sort of will to want to desire this sort of reason, this sort of reflective understanding is actually a part of his context, and trying to escape context is actually paradoxically perhaps if you want to look at sort of literature and our sort of history of like characters of people we find compelling, you obviously see that kind of archetype of the antisocial sort of Faustian character that has to necessarily escape his own background and kind of take the step back away from everyone else to kind of escape force itself. This could be said for Locke's one for the understanding is part of that Puritan mandate of if we can understand forces, perhaps we can escape them and then get the all-encompassing sort of perspective, or this sort of empirical knowledge, as it were. But one of the things that's also interesting is when he talks about the proportion of evidence, what does that really mean? That doesn't just exist out there in this sort of generalized way that we can all agree to step back on to see, but it's actually from the author's perspective of what compels him towards the evidence. And so concepts like the tabula rasa, for example, this sort of in a way actually far cry from, what we consider today as this sort of independence of structure, of trying to always overcome it, and take away something more, that sort of concept of progress, which I think is very interesting to incorporate in evaluating our history of thinkers. These sort of projects and context is ultimately what actually is of the more importance, in my opinion, than the actual reasoning itself. This kind of goes hand in hand, perhaps in an estranged way, with one of my favorite thinkers of the counter-Enlightenment in his time, with Joseph De Maistre's understanding of the written word necessarily is comes from a fallenness of a fracturing of these sort of relationships or traditions. In order to, if we wouldn't be writing it down unless we were forgetting it, as he eloquently put, throughout his political constitution work, that essay on how constitutions, they aren't just these, laws of reason that we decided were, good in this sort of utilitarian aspect, but actually, it was written within us. What drove us to even get to that point to begin with. This is something that obviously is problematic when you look at this sort of tabula rasa way of emerging in the world, as compared to concepts like thrownness and being immersed in this sort of world horizon, and trying to guide yourself from this inherited culture that and particular time that you're in. Ultimately, generalized abstraction has to recursively, in the end, sort of take a step back from these things considered to their ends. And that's why I think it's interesting when, we go on with Locke to Berkeley and then Hume, that, he's getting undermined from empiricists. It's actually people who are saying, no, you're actually faulty on your empiricism. And I think that kind of speaks to the failed notion of really modeling in structure and theory in the writtenness of the word that De Maistre talks about. It's this constant reevaluation of current social norms, because ultimately it's not rooted in anything. And perhaps that also could go with, the concept of deism and, the belief of these sort of indifference of now these metaphysical social structures that at one point did have this rootedness within, a theological perspective or political philosophy, and, the church and the state, etc. Or even this, the indictment within, trying to use the state to overcome the church, is also a process all on its own, I believe. And obviously, De Maistre comes at it from a Christian perspective of, God came and spoke to us. He didn't, write down his teachings. He didn't write down these teachings and way of authority. He spoke it to us. And so I think it's important to understand that, us as theory, on this sort of theoretician front, need to understand our own sort of fallenness, and that ultimately we are trying to model and really capture, really, I would actually say, I know this might sound, really strange, but that sort of compelling and quite literal love an affinity and the drawnness to certain particular things. And I suppose, the classic example for that would be as a man, probably talking to other dudes, I imagine. When you see a female you're attracted to, you're taking her entirety of who she is. There is particular features, of course, that make her attractive, but it's her entire context that ultimately will make you have that sort of true feelings of companionship, or the sort of love that I think anyone wants. And I think that also is true for things and like rule of law, and why it doesn't really make do. There's certain ethics and ideas, I think, within strong friend groups and companions that I've had over the years, that we don't sit around and speak words on loyalty. We simply act upon it. We don't just sit around and reason on why it's good. It's spontaneous. It's within us. You don't just suspend yourself away, but you take in the entire context of everything. And so I think that's really interesting to use De Maistre in that sort of sense of understanding fallenness and these sort of conspiratorial thinking that we're kind of forced to do. There's no shortage of theories around us on how everything works and structures, and it very much has the sort of properties of what theological apologetics did as well. And it's kind of interesting to see how science tried to and reason tried to come above it, but ultimately it fell in on itself, because it tried to root itself within itself recursively. When you look at all these sort of Enlightenment thinkers early on, ultimately they did reference back to a sort of divine authority, but it was ultimately, to their defense, their own undoing. Once you were taking away that sort of metaphysical, divine explanation, as we talked about before on the channel, then you really are just modeling and constantly updating these sort of conspiracy theories and explanations of faculties of the mind and their representations, and trying to contain this sort of context that ultimately I don't believe that you really can, and these sort of psychological explanations that will ultimately eat itself in its sort of recursive need to recapitulate itself. It's kind of interesting to see how, as Moldbug was trying to point out when he was talking to Tucker, you have these institutions that are created to solve problems, such as virologists, who ultimately have to create bigger problems for themselves in order to gain any sort of traction in these sort of structures. And so if you're away from the divineness or the sort of teachings of these sort of metaphysical traditions of what we were, then you're constantly reevaluating and realigning yourself to these sort of abstract, necessarily tabula rasa rootlessness. And so it's easy to see how in the end this sort of make peace attitude eventually leads to the sort of multicultural norms we see today. That kind of frustratingly, you can see this sort of almost will to make peace, despite peace obviously not being around anymore. I think this obviously goes back into this sort of identity of, European tradition, Anglo tradition to be specific, I would say. And so, another thing I wanted to perhaps brush up on as well is, obviously we talk a lot of, trying to make it within these sort of social structures. How are we going to align ourselves or be, inquiries into optics and things like that. I think you run the gambit, of course, of in this sort of nihilistic unrootedness of these sort of structures that there is no message that actually can come through. If it's, put through the grinder of the sort of rule of law that's open for interpretation, that doesn't actually have, but in a way it does. We do actually have, an author class. We do have the interpretive class, but they're shamed, and ultimately who would want to take responsibility for the state of the world right now to begin with? It would be, I guess analogous to sports with, inheriting a very, very bad football program or something like that you're trying to turn around and, get back to its glory days. But it's not that simple. You have to, rehash everything. And I think that's really what the project is about with the Enlightenment, and understanding these sort of paradoxes and, what it means to actually have the context of the author, and knowing that these sort of ways of thinking is how we can perhaps change the world and to make a better place. But, just to kind of push for examples, you see, of course, you have these institutions that are really passed down nonetheless, as a filmer would have, alluded to, these sort of, God's reproduction of authority is going to happen regardless of whether or not it's, recognized by these, social constructs. And so, nonetheless, you still see this sort of, fatherly inheritance that's passed down. But of course, paradoxically, that's the thing about, the fatherly structure is, we also come from this background of, wanting to stand eye to eye with the Father one day. But that also, in a way, is an instantiation of, honor for the Father, is that the Father, in a way, does want to be surpassed. If he understands progress and, he cares about the goodness of it, or, takes his own history seriously, then he understands that as, life leaves you, and, you pass down teachings when you're older. And this is something I've noticed too, is, not just in my own life, but, on a personal basis with people I know and family. You do tend to see that as people get older, even though they are, there's the Karen mom that's like all in meme culture about being a prude. And usually the bitter Karen, though, doesn't really have anything or anyone to pass on to, so, they kind of have that sort of bitter reprisal and attitude that you could talk about. But, when you think about, happier older people, you certainly seem to see this sort of, willingness to give. Certainly they were far more likely to be these sort of self-evident, rational, self-interested human beings, perhaps in, that younger, more survival stage of their life, but ultimately, survival, while it is important and a necessary good, I wouldn't argue against that. You ultimately do not survive, though, and so that also has to be accounted for. And what are the implications of that with trying to make with reason and looking for a rootedness that's sort of cross instantiation, a sort of peer-to-peer social construct. What are the implications of that is obviously one of the biggest philosophical discussions of the last couple centuries. And so I think to really wrap up this discussion, I just wanted to cover a couple of counter-Enlightenment thinkers that I think is interesting. Perhaps also to maybe put a bow on this, it would be interesting to see how the intellectual at this stage and what Juvenal would have talked about as this sort of outgrowth similar to the rival monarch who overcame his sort of feudal stable or faction, how the intellectual, how the ideologue now, this sort of social sphere of currency, of being allowed to say certain things if you tote certain ideological signifiers at certain points to supplant other rivals in this sort of game. They themselves are also this sort of outgrowth that I think is interesting to keep an eye on, and how this sort of outgrowth will ultimately theorize and model in this sort of intellectual way is perhaps something that's considered to be cutting edge and not to be taken lightly. And perhaps there's also another thing to really add on is, if we just have this sort of recursive abstract reasoning to reference in the end, and these sort of social models, as opposed to faithful explanation that I've talked about, or that the theologian perspective. What really does that mean other than the arrival of technology and techniques to really be the sort of driver, actually, as opposed to this sort of off supplanted individual who arises on his own terrain, as opposed to actually being a part of it and being the inheritor of it, and the indebtedness that comes with it. You don't have to just get caught up forever doing the same thing over and over. Of course, that then the future wouldn't be the future. Particulars happen, and but ultimately we do kind of return as a people in certain ways. And so obviously that is one of the main goals, I believe, that one should identify with around here. But yeah, I'm going to wrap up this video. I've went on too long. I hope you guys enjoyed this rambler. I'll see you guys for Berkeley and the other empirical thinkers.